The marble floors of the Grandview Country Club gleamed under the massive crystal chandeliers, each surface reflecting the golden light that danced across designer gowns and tailored suits. The air buzzed with the chatter of Chicago's elite, their laughter mingling with the soft notes of a string quartet positioned near the French doors that opened onto manicured gardens. Ice clinked against crystal glasses as servers glided between guests, offering champagne that cost more per bottle than most people made in a week. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Elena Martinez, and I stood at the edge of this glittering world, watching my sister Victoria command the room like the queen she'd always believed herself to be. Tonight was her engagement party, a celebration that had consumed months of planning and enough money to buy a small house. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago society: politicians, business moguls, old money families, whose names graced hospital wings and university buildings. Victoria's laugh rang out above the crowd, bright and musical, as she displayed her engagement ring to a cluster of admirers. The diamond was massive, easily 5 carats, catching the light with every gesture of her perfectly manicured hand. Her fiancé, Bradley Whitmore III, stood beside her with the confidence of a man who'd never known want, his family's pharmaceutical fortune ensuring he'd never have to. They looked perfect together, like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread about beautiful people living beautiful lives. I smoothed down my simple black dress, purchased from a department store rather than a boutique, and tried to blend into the background. The fabric felt scratchy against my skin, a stark contrast to the silk and satin that surrounded me. My shoes, comfortable flats instead of designer heels, made no sound on the polished marble as I moved through the crowd. I'd learned long ago how to be invisible at these events, how to smile politely and nod at the right moments while counting the minutes, until I could escape. The ballroom was a masterpiece of excess. Towering floral arrangements of white roses and peonies created natural barriers between conversation groups, their sweet fragrance mixing with expensive perfumes, and the subtle scent of money that seemed to permeate everything. Gold-rimmed china held delicate hors d'oeuvres that disappeared as quickly as they appeared, replaced by even more elaborate creations from the kitchen of Chicago's most exclusive caterer. My parents held court near the bar, my father resplendent in his custom-tailored tuxedo, my mother draped in emerald silk that matched the necklace she'd inherited from her grandmother. Margaret and Robert Martinez had built their real estate empire from nothing, clawing their way up from a cramped apartment on the South Side to a mansion in Lincoln Park. But success had changed them, or perhaps revealed who they'd always been underneath. The struggle had made them hard, and prosperity had made them cold. They spoke in animated tones to the Caldwell family, whose construction company had partnered with my parents on several high-profile developments. Miss Caldwell's voice carried across the room as she praised Victoria's beauty and accomplishments, her words dripping with the kind of admiration that money could buy. My father's chest puffed with pride, his smile wide and genuine in a way I rarely saw directed at me. I watched from my corner, nursing a glass of champagne that had long since gone flat, as Victoria accepted congratulations from wave after wave of guests. She'd always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, whose every achievement was celebrated with parties and gifts and endless praise. Her college graduation had been marked with a trip to Europe. Her first job at the family company had been announced with a spread in the society pages, and now her engagement to Bradley was being celebrated with a party that would be talked about for months. The contrast between us had never been starker. Where Victoria was tall and willowy, I was average height with curves that fashion magazines would call healthy, with thinly veiled disdain. Where her hair fell in perfect golden waves, mine was dark brown and stubbornly straight, refusing to hold a curl no matter how much product I used. When she moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything, I'd learned to ask for little and expect less. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was probably the only person in the room who knew what it felt like to want something, to work for every dollar, to lie awake at night wondering if you'd made the right choices. While Victoria had been handed a position at Martinez Real Estate straight out of college, I'd been expected to find my own way. While she'd been given a trust fund and a car for her 16th birthday, I'd worked part-time jobs throughout high school just to have spending money. Alina, my mother's voice cut through my thoughts like a blade. She was beckoning me over to where she stood with a group of her friends, their faces bright with curiosity. I forced a smile and made my way through the crowd, careful not to bump into anyone or draw attention to myself. The last thing I wanted was to create a scene at Victoria's party. "There she is," my mother said, her arms sliding around my waist in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like a trap. "This is my other daughter, Alina. She's been so busy with her little project." The word projects hung in the air like a dismissal. I knew what she meant. My work as a freelance graphic designer wasn't a real career in her eyes, just something to keep me occupied until I found a husband or gave up and asked for help. The fact that I'd been supporting myself for 3 years, that I'd built a small but steady client base, that I'd never asked them for a penny, none of that mattered because it wasn't their version of success. "How lovely," said Miss Pemberton, a woman whose husband owned half the restaurants in downtown Chicago. Her smile was polite but distant, the kind reserved for people who didn't quite belong. "And what exactly do you do?" "I'm a graphic designer," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the way the words seemed to fall flat in the rarefied air of the ballroom. "I work with small businesses, help them with their branding and marketing materials." "Oh, how entrepreneurial," Miss Pemberton replied, though her tone suggested she thought it was anything but. "In my day, young ladies didn't need to worry about such things, but times change, I suppose." My mother's grip on my waist tightened slightly, her nails digging in just enough to remind me to behave. "Alina has always been very independent," she said, and somehow managed to make independence sound like a character flaw. "She insists on doing everything herself, even when we've offered to help." The lie came so easily, so smoothly that I almost believed it myself. They'd never offered to help, never shown the slightest interest in my work or my life. The few times I'd tried to share my successes, a new client, a project I was proud of, a month where I'd made more money than I'd ever made before, they'd responded with polite disinterest or subtle suggestions that I was wasting my time. "Well, at least one of your daughters has found her way," said Mrs. Caldwell, nodding toward Victoria, who was posing for photos with Bradley near the chocolate fountain. "What a beautiful couple they make. And Bradley's family is so well connected. This marriage will open so many doors for Victoria." "Yes, we're very pleased," my mother agreed, her voice warm with genuine pride. "Victoria has always known exactly what she wanted and how to get it. She's going to make a wonderful wife." The implication was clear. Victoria was succeeding where I was failing. Victoria had found a man who could provide for her, who could elevate her status, who could give her the life she deserved. I, on the other hand, was still fumbling around with my little projects, still single at 28, still living in a modest apartment instead of a mansion. The string quartet struck up a waltz, and couples began to move onto the dance floor. Bradley spun Victoria in a perfect circle, her emerald gown flowing around her like water. She threw her head back and laughed, the sound carrying across the room like music. They were the picture of happiness, of love, of everything a relationship should be according to the society page. I excused myself from the group and made my way toward the ladies' room, needing a moment to collect myself. The hallway was quieter, lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men in military uniforms and women in elaborate Victorian gowns. The Martinez family history, purchased along with the portraits when they'd bought the house from an old Chicago family fallen on hard times. But before I could reach the sanctuary of the restroom, I heard my name being called again. This time it was Victoria herself, gliding toward me with that same radiant smile she'd been wearing all evening. Behind her followed a small entourage of bridesmaids and friends, all of them dressed in coordinating pastels that made them look like an expensive bouquet. "Alina, there you are." Victoria's voice was bright and cheerful, but I'd known her long enough to recognize the undercurrent of something sharper. "I've been looking everywhere for you. I wanted to introduce you to some of Bradley's friends." She gestured to the group behind her, and I recognized several faces from the society pages. There was Madison Blackwood, whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels, Jessica Fairfax, whose family had made their fortune in steel generations ago, and Caroline Ashford, who'd married into old money and spent her time organizing charity galas and spa retreats. "Girls, this is my sister Elena," Victoria said, her arm linking through mine in a gesture that looked sisterly but felt possessive. "She's the artistic one in the family. What do you call them? Logos?" The word came out of her mouth like she was speaking a foreign language, with just enough emphasis to make it clear she found the entire concept slightly ridiculous. The women smiled politely, their eyes taking in my simple dress, my department store shoes, my lack of jewelry beyond a small pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. "How interesting," Madison said, though her tone suggested she found it anything. "I've always admired people who can make a living from their hobbies. It must be so freeing to not have to worry about traditional success." The comment hit its mark perfectly. In one sentence, she'd managed to dismiss my career as a hobby, imply that I wasn't traditionally successful, and suggest that my lack of ambition was somehow a choice rather than a limitation. The other women nodded along, their expressions sympathetic in the way people look at someone who's just been diagnosed with a minor but chronic illness. "Elena has always been the independent type," Victoria continued, and I could hear the edge creeping into her voice. "She insists on doing everything herself, even when the rest of us have tried to help her see that there are easier ways to live." "Easier ways?" I asked, though I already knew where this was going. "Well, you know," Victoria said, her smile never wavering. "Finding the right partner, building the right connections, focusing on what really matters, instead of chasing after every little project that comes along." Caroline nodded sagely. "Marriage is still the best career move a woman can make," she said. "Everything else is just temporary." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The words stung because they echoed every conversation I'd had with my parents over the past 5 years. Every family dinner had included some variation of the same theme. When was I going to settle down? When was I going to find a nice man? When was I going to stop playing at independence and embrace my proper role as a wife and mother? "I'm happy with my life," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Are you, though?" Victoria's question was gentle, almost caring, but I could see the glint in her eyes. "I mean, really happy. Living in that tiny apartment, working all hours for clients who probably don't even appreciate what you do. Don't you ever wonder what it would be like to have someone take care of you for a change?" The group had grown larger, I realized. More guests had drifted over, drawn by the sound of conversation and the magnetic pull of Victoria's presence. They formed a loose circle around us, their faces expectant, waiting for whatever entertainment was about to unfold. "I take care of myself," I said, but my voice sounded weaker than I intended. "Of course you do," Victoria replied, and her tone was so patronizing that I felt my cheeks burn. "And you've done such a good job of it too." "Really, Elena, I admire your determination. But don't you think it's time to admit that maybe, just maybe, you'd be happier if you let someone else worry about the bills and the deadlines and all those stressful little details?" The crowd was fully engaged now, their conversations trailing off as they turned to watch. I could feel their eyes on me, cataloging my simple dress, my lack of jewelry, my obvious discomfort in this glittering world they moved through so effortlessly. "I don't need anyone to take care of me," I said, but the words came out sounding defensive rather than confident. Victoria's laugh was like silver bells, light and musical, and completely devastating. "Oh, Elena," she said, and her voice was full of the kind of affection that felt like pity. "You're so stubborn, but look around you." She gestured to the ballroom, to the crystal chandeliers and the marble floors, and the guests in their designer gowns. "Look at what's possible when you make the right choices. Look at what you could have if you just stop being so difficult." The word hung in the air between us, and I felt something inside me crumble. Difficult. That's what I was to them. Not independent, not self-sufficient, not successful in my own right. Difficult. A problem to be solved. A rough edge to be smoothed away. "The truth is," Victoria continued, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent space around us. You're nothing without us. Nothing without this family, nothing without the connections we could give you, nothing without the life we could help you build if you'd just swallow your pride and ask for help. The words hit me like a physical blow. Nothing without us. I stood there, surrounded by Chicago's elite, wearing my discount dress and my grandmother's pearls, and felt the weight of their judgment settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I'm not nothing, I whispered, but my voice was barely audible above the soft strains of the string quartet. Of course you're not, Victoria said, and her smile was radiant with what looked like genuine warmth. You're my sister, and I love you, but love means being honest, doesn't it? And honestly, Elena, this whole independence thing isn't working for you. You're 28 years old, living paycheck to paycheck, with no husband, no real career prospects, no future beyond whatever little projects you can scrape together. The crowd murmured their agreement, soft sounds of sympathy and understanding. They'd all been where I was, their expressions seemed to say. They'd all had to make the hard choices, had to put aside childish dreams in favor of practical realities. But it's not too late, Victoria continued, and now her voice was full of hope, as if she were offering me a lifeline. You could still find someone, still build a real life. You just have to stop pretending that doing everything yourself is some kind of virtue. My hands were shaking now, a fine tremor that started in my fingers and spread up my arm. I clasped them together, trying to stop the trembling, but it was no use. The champagne glass I'd been holding slipped from my grip and shattered on the marble floor, the sound sharp and final in the sudden silence. Oh, Elena, Victoria said, and her voice was full of concern as she reached out to steady me. Are you all right? You look so pale. The attention of the entire room was on us now. Conversations had stopped, heads had turned, and I could feel the weight of their collective gaze like a physical thing. These people who moved through the world with such confidence, such certainty, looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. I'm fine, I managed to say, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. No, you're not, Victoria said, and her concern seemed so genuine that for a moment I almost believed she truly cared. You're overwhelmed, aren't you? All this talk about your future, about what you could have if you just made different choices. It's a lot to process. She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. My sister has always been the sensitive type, she explained, and somehow managed to make sensitivity sound like a weakness. She feels things so deeply, takes everything so personally. It's one of her most endearing qualities, really, but it can make life so much harder than it needs to be. The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd like waves. They understood. Their faces seemed to say, they'd all known someone like me, someone who made everything more complicated than it needed to be. The thing is, Victoria continued, and now her voice took on the tone of someone delivering a difficult truth. Elena has never learned to accept help. She's spent so many years trying to prove she doesn't need anyone that she's forgotten how to let people care for her. She reached out and took my hand, her grip warm and steady. But we're family, she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. And family means never giving up on each other, even when someone we love is too stubborn to see what's best for them. The crowd made soft sounds of approval, touched by this display of sisterly devotion. They saw Victoria reaching out to her difficult sister, offering love and support despite my obvious flaws. They saw a woman trying to save someone who was too proud to save herself. I just want you to be happy, Victoria said, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I want you to have what I have, what all of us have, a partner who loves you, a life that means something, a future that's bigger than just surviving from one month to the next. She squeezed my hand gently, and when she spoke again, her voice was so soft that the crowd had to lean in to hear. You don't have to keep struggling alone, Elena. You don't have to keep pretending that being by yourself is the same thing as being strong. The words were like daggers, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. She was dismantling me piece by piece, taking apart every choice I'd made, every small success I'd achieved, and reframing them as failures. My independence became stubbornness, my self-sufficiency became isolation, my career became a desperate scramble for survival. I'm not pretending, I said, but my voice was so weak that I barely heard it myself. aren't you? Victoria's question was gentle, almost loving. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're working yourself to death for clients who don't value you, living in a place that's barely big enough for one person, and convincing yourself that being alone is better than being loved. The truth of her words hit me like a physical blow. She was right, wasn't she? I was working 60-hour weeks for clients who paid late and complained about everything. I was living in a studio apartment where I could touch both walls with my arms outstretched. I was spending my Friday nights alone, working on proposals and invoices while she was at parties like this one, surrounded by people who adored her. But it doesn't have to be this way, Victoria continued, and now her voice was full of hope again. You could have so much more if you'd just let us help you, let us introduce you to the right people. Let us help you find someone who could give you the life you deserve. She gestured to the glittering ballroom around us, to the beautiful people in their expensive clothes, to the life of luxury and ease that surrounded her like a protective bubble. This could be your world too, Elena. All you have to do is stop fighting it. The crowd was nodding along now, their faces full of encouragement and support. They wanted to help me, their expressions said. They wanted to welcome me into their world, to save me from the gray existence I'd built for myself. I don't want your help, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if they were true. Victoria's smile was patient, understanding. I know you don't think you do, she said, but sometimes the people who love us have to make the hard choices, and have to tell us the truths we don't want to hear. She turned to address the crowd again, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. Elena has always been the dreamer in our family, she said, and her tone was fond but also slightly pitiful. She's spent so many years chasing after this idea of independence that she's forgotten what it means to be part of something bigger than herself. The words echoed in the sudden silence, and I felt their weight settling on my shoulders like a judgment. Part of something bigger. That's what I'd been missing, what I'd been running from, the security of belonging, of being taken care of having someone else make the difficult decision. But dreams don't pay the bills, Victoria continued, and her voice was gentle but firm, and independence doesn't keep you warm at night. And all the pride in the world doesn't change the fact that you're 28 years old with nothing to show for it but a collection of business cards, and a lease on an apartment that's barely bigger than most people's closet. Each word was like a small cut, precise and careful but devastating in its accuracy. She was right about everything, wasn't she? I was living paycheck to paycheck, scrambling for clients, pretending that my tiny apartment was cozy when it was really just cramped. I was telling myself that I was building something meaningful when really I was just treading water, barely keeping my head above the surface. Elena, Victoria said, and her voice was so soft, so full of love and concern, that I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Look at me. I raised my head, meeting her gaze for the first time since this conversation had begun. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her face soft with what looked like genuine affection. You're my sister, she said, and her voice broke slightly on the word. And I love you too much to watch you keep destroying yourself like this. You deserve so much more than what you're settling for. You deserve to be loved, to be cherished, to be taken care of by someone who sees how special you are. The crowd murmured their agreement, touched by this display of sisterly devotion. They saw Victoria fighting for me, trying to save me from myself, offering me a chance at the happiness I'd been too proud to accept. But you have to want it, Victoria continued, and now her voice was firm again, decisive. You have to stop clinging to this idea that struggle equals strength, that suffering equals virtue. You have to be willing to let someone else take care of you for once. She paused, letting the words sink in, and when she spoke again, her voice carried across the silent ballroom like a verdict. Because the truth is, Elena, you're nothing without us, nothing without this family, nothing without the connections we could give you, nothing without the life we could help you build. And until you're ready to admit that, until you're ready to stop pretending that being alone is the same thing as being strong, you're going to keep living this half-life, this shadow existence where you're always scrambling, always struggling, always just barely getting by. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt something inside me break. She was right, about everything. I was nothing without them, nothing without the safety net they represented, nothing without the world they could open up to me if I'd just swallow my pride and ask for help. I stood there in my discount dress, surrounded by Chicago's elite, and felt the weight of my own insignificance crushing down on me like a physical thing. The champagne glass at my feet, the shocked faces around me, the string quartet playing softly in the background, it all felt like a tableau of my own failure, my own stubborn refusal to accept reality. That she was wrong, that I was happy with my life, that I didn't need anyone or anything beyond what I'd built for myself. But looking around at the glittering ballroom, at the beautiful people in their expensive clothes, at the life of ease and luxury that surrounded Victoria like a protective bubble, I felt the hollow ring of my own protests. Maybe she was right, maybe I was nothing without them, maybe it was time to stop pretending otherwise. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, and I could feel the weight of every gaze in the ballroom pressing down on my shoulder. Victoria's words hung in the air, their cruelty disguised as concern, their violence wrapped in the soft silk of sisterly love. The broken champagne glass at my feet caught the light from the chandeliers, each shard reflecting my fractured composure back at me in miniature fragments. "You don't have to answer right now," Victoria said, her voice gentle as a summer breeze, though I could see the satisfaction glittering in her eyes. "I know this is overwhelming. Sometimes the truth hits us harder than we expect." My mother appeared at my elbow as if summoned, her emerald silk rustling as she positioned herself between me and any possible escape route. "Victoria's right, darling," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear every word. "We've all been worried about you for quite some time." The word worried fell from her lips like a stone into still water, sending ripples of understanding through the assembled guests. They nodded knowingly, these people who had never worried about rent, or grocery bills, or whether a client would pay their invoice on time. Their worry was a luxury item, something they could afford to indulge in when their own lives were sufficiently secure. "Perhaps we should take this conversation somewhere more private," my father suggested, appearing beside my mother with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades orchestrating business deals and social situations. His voice carried the subtle authority that had built the Martinez real estate empire, the kind of quiet power that made people lean in to listen. But Victoria shook her head, her golden hair catching the light as she moved. "No, Daddy. Elena needs to hear this from all of us, and she needs to know that everyone here supports her. This isn't about shame or embarrassment. This is about love." The crowd murmured their agreement, soft sounds of encouragement and support that felt like a noose tightening around my throat. Love. She was calling this love, this public dissection of my life, this careful dismantling of every choice I'd made in the past decade. Love was supposed to lift you up, not tear you down piece by piece in front of an audience of strangers. "Elena, sweetheart," my mother continued, her hand finding my arm and squeezing gently, "we've been talking as a family, and we think it's time for some tough love. You're not a child anymore. You can't keep pretending that this little graphic design hobby is going to sustain you forever." The word sliced through me like a blade. 3 years of 18-hour days, of building a client base from nothing, of learning software and marketing, and business management on my own. 3 years of proud independence, of paying my own bills and making my own decisions, and she reduced it all to a hobby. "It's not a hobby," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "It's my career. I support myself. I've never asked you for money." "And that's exactly the problem," my father interjected, his tone patient, but firm. "You're so determined to prove your independence that you're sabotaging your own future. Look around you, Elaine. Look at the opportunities you're missing while you're hunched over your computer in that cramped apartment." He gestured broadly at the ballroom, at the assembled wealth and power that surrounded us on all sides. "Everyone in this room could help you. Everyone here has connections, resources, opportunities that could transform your life, but you have to be willing to accept help. You have to be willing to admit that maybe, just maybe, you don't have all the answers." The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Why struggle when I could simply stop struggling? Why work so hard when there were people right here who could make my life easier with a single phone call? Why choose the difficult path when the easy one was being offered to me on a silver platter? "We're not saying you have to give up your creative interests," Victoria said, her voice warm with understanding. We're just saying that maybe it's time to find more sustainable way to pursue them. As a married woman, you'd have the financial security to explore your artistic side without the pressure of having to make money from it. Married woman. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with implications and expectations. I could see the future they were painting for me, a wealthy husband, who would indulge my creative interests, as long as they didn't interfere with my real duties as a wife and hostess, a life of charity luncheons and gallery openings, of being someone's plus one instead of someone in my own right. Actually, my mother said, her voice brightening as if she'd just remembered something delightful, we've been meaning to introduce you to someone. Robert, didn't the Hendersons mention that their son Michael is still single? My father's face lit up with enthusiasm. Michael Henderson, brilliant young man, he just made partner at his law firm and his family has such strong ties to the community, he'd be perfect for Elena. The Hendersons, I remembered them vaguely from other family gatherings, a couple in their 60s who owned a chain of furniture stores across the Midwest. Their son Michael would be safe, respectable, the kind of man who would provide financial security in exchange for a suitable wife, who could host dinner parties and produce appropriate children at appropriate intervals. We could arrange a meeting, Victoria said, warming to the idea with obvious excitement. Maybe a dinner party next week, something casual, just family and a few close friends. You'd love Michael, Elaine. He's intelligent, successful, and he's specifically looking for a wife who appreciates the finer things in life. The finer things in life, code for someone who would be grateful for luxury, who would understand that her role was to be ornamental rather than functional. Someone who would know her place and stay in it. I don't want to meet Michael Henderson, I said, and the words came out sharper than I intended. I don't want a husband to take care of me. I don't want to be anyone's decorative accessory. The crowd stirred at my sudden show of defiance. Soft gasps and murmurs rippling through the assembled guests. I could see disapproval flickering across faces, the kind of polite censure reserved for those who forgot their place in polite society. Elena, my mother said, her voice carrying a warning note, don't be dramatic. No one is suggesting you become a decorative accessory. We're suggesting you find a partner who can provide you with the life you deserve. The life I deserve, I repeated, and I could hear the bitterness creeping into my voice. According to who? According to you, according to all of these people who've never had to worry about where their next meal was coming from. My father's face darkened at my tone. Elena, Maria Martinez, he said, using my full name the way he had when I was a child caught misbehaving. You will not embarrass this family with your ingratitude. We have spent the last 10 minutes trying to help you see reason, and this is how you respond. Ingratitude. Another word that cut deep, another accusation that painted my independence as a character flaw. I was ungrateful for rejecting their vision of my future, ungrateful for wanting to choose my own path, ungrateful for believing I could build a life that belonged to me alone. We're offering you everything, Victoria said, and her voice was thick with hurt and disappointment. Security, love, a future that's bigger than scraping together freelance projects, and you're throwing it back in our faces like it means nothing. She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. This is what I was talking about, she said, and her tone was sad but resigned. Elena has convinced herself that accepting help is the same thing as admitting defeat. She'd rather struggle alone than admit that maybe, just maybe, she can't do everything by herself. The murmurs of sympathy and understanding rippled through the crowd like a tide. They had all been where I was. Their expressions seemed to say they had all faced the choice between pride and practicality, and they had chosen wisely. They had chosen comfort over struggle, security over uncertainty, and look how well it had worked out for them. It's not about pride, I said, though even as the words left my mouth I wondered if they were true. It's about autonomy. It's about having the right to make my own choices, even if they're the wrong ones. But why choose the wrong one? My mother asked, and her voice was genuinely puzzled, as if my resistance was incomprehensible to her. Why choose to struggle when you could choose to be happy? Happy, such a simple word, but loaded with assumptions about what happiness should look like. Their version of happiness was measured in dollars and social status, in security and comfort and the approval of people who mattered. My version of happiness was messier, more uncertain, built on the shaky foundation of doing work I loved and answering to no one but myself. I am happy, I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Was I happy, or was I just stubborn? Was I building something meaningful, or was I just too proud to admit that I was drowning? Are you? Victoria's question was gentle, almost loving, but I could see the trap in it, because from where I'm standing, you look exhausted. You look like someone who's been fighting a losing battle for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to not be at war. The accuracy of her observation hit me like a physical blow. I was exhausted. I had been fighting for so long, working so hard, pushing so relentlessly toward goals that sometimes felt impossibly distant. When was the last time I had felt truly relaxed? When was the last time I had gone to sleep without worrying about tomorrow's deadlines or next month's rent? We're not your enemies, Elena, my father said, his voice softer now, more conciliatory. We're your family. We want what's best for you, even if you can't see it right now. Family, the word was supposed to be a comfort, a promise of unconditional love and support, but standing there in that glittering ballroom, surrounded by people who claimed to love me while systematically dismantling everything I had built, the word felt more like a trap than a blessing. What you want is for me to be someone I'm not, I said, and my voice was steadier now, fueled by a growing anger that burned away the self-doubt. You want me to be Victoria, you want me to smile prettily, and marry well, and never cause any problem. We want you to be happy, Victoria said, but there was an edge to her voice now, a hint of impatience with my continued resistance. We want you to stop making your life so much harder than it needs to be. Maybe hard isn't the same thing as wrong, I said, and the words surprised me with their certainty. Maybe struggle isn't something to be avoided at all costs. Maybe building something with your own hands is worth more than being handed something perfect. The crowd stirred uneasily at my words, sensing a shift in the dynamic they had been enjoying. This wasn't going according to script. I was supposed to break down, to admit they were right, to accept their help with grateful tears. I wasn't supposed to fight back. Elena, my mother said, and her voice carried a warning now. You're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you, and you're acting like we're the enemy. You are the enemy, I said, and the words came out louder than I intended, carrying across the ballroom with shocking clarity. You're my family, and you're supposed to support me, but instead, you're trying to tear down everything I've worked for. The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. I had crossed a line, violated some unspoken rule about how these conversations were supposed to go. Elena, Victoria said, and her voice was sharp now, all pretense of gentle concern falling away. You need to calm down. You're embarrassing yourself. I'm embarrassing myself. I laughed, and the sound was harsh and bitter in the perfumed air of the ballroom. I'm embarrassing myself by refusing to let you publicly humiliate me, by standing up for the life I've built. The life you've built, my father repeated, and his voice was cold now, authoritative in the way that had cowed business rivals and competitors for decades. You mean that studio apartment, that handful of clients who pay you peanuts, that uncertain future with no safety net, and no security. Each word was like a slap, designed to remind me of my vulnerability, of how precarious my independence really was, and the worst part was that he wasn't wrong. My apartment was tiny, my income was irregular, my future was built on nothing more solid than my own determination and skill. At least it's mine, I said, and my voice was growing stronger with each word. At least I earned it. At least I didn't get it by marrying the right person, or being born into the right family. The insult hung in the air between us, and I saw my mother's face go pale with shock. I had never spoken to them like this before, had never directly challenged the foundations of their success, or the choices they had made. Elena, Maria Martinez, my father said, and his voice was like you will apologize to your mother right now, and then you will listen to what we're trying to tell you. No, I said, and the word came out clear and strong, and final. I won't apologize for telling the truth, and I won't listen to any more of this. The crowd was fully engaged now, their conversations forgotten in favor of the drama unfolding before them. They leaned in closer, their faces bright with curiosity and anticipation. This was better than any theater performance.
more entertaining than any society gossip they had heard in months. "You want to know what I think?" I continued, my voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "I think you're all terrified. I think you're terrified that someone might actually be happy without all of this." I gestured broadly at the opulent surroundings, at the expensive gowns and jewelry that glittered under the chandelier light.
I think you need me to fail because if I succeed, if I actually build a life that's meaningful and fulfilling without marrying into wealth or inheriting a trust fund, then it means all of your choices were just that. Choices. And maybe not the only good ones. Victoria's face was flushed now, her carefully applied makeup doing little to hide the anger that blazed in her eyes. "You think you're so much better than us," she said, and her voice was low and dangerous. "You think your struggle makes you noble, makes you pure. But you know what it really makes you?" She paused, letting the question hang in the air, and when she spoke again, her voice was loud enough to carry to every corner of the ballroom. "It makes you alone. It makes you bitter. It makes you the kind of person who stands in a room full of people who love her and sees only enemies. It makes you pathetic." The word hit me like a physical blow, and I felt something inside me crack. Pathetic. Not misguided. Not stubborn. Not even wrong. Pathetic. Someone to be pitied rather than respected. Someone whose struggles were meaningless rather than heroic. "At least I'm not a kept woman," I said, and the words came out sharp and cruel, designed to hurt as much as I had been hurt. "At least I'm not marrying someone for their bank account and calling it love." The gasp from the crowd was audible this time, a sharp sound of shock and disapproval. I had gone too far, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Victoria's face went white, then red, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "How dare you?" she whispered, and her voice was shaking with rage. "How dare you stand there in your discount dress and your second-hand shoes, and judge me for finding love with someone who can actually provide for me?" "Love," I repeated, and I couldn't keep the scorn out of my voice. "Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like a business transaction. You get security and status, and Bradley gets a pretty trophy wife who'll look good at company events." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, sensing that the atmosphere in the room had shifted beyond the reach of gentle background music. Every eye in the ballroom was fixed on us, every ear straining to catch the next word in this very public family drama. "You know what your problem is, Elena?" Victoria said, and her voice was calm now, deadly calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than her anger. "You're jealous. You're jealous that I'm beautiful and loved and successful, and you're angry that all your independence and all your struggle haven't gotten you anywhere close to what I have." She gestured to herself, to her perfect hair and flawless makeup, to the engagement ring that caught the light like a small star on her finger. "You're jealous that I'm smart enough to recognize a good thing when I see it, and you're too proud to admit that maybe, just maybe, I made the right choice." The truth of her words hit me like a sledgehammer. Was I jealous? Standing there in my simple dress, watching her glow with happiness and success, surrounded by people who adored her, it was hard to deny that some part of me wanted what she had. The security, the love, the certainty of a future that was bright and stable and free from worry. "You could have this too," she continued, her voice softer now, almost gentle. "You could have someone who loves you, someone who takes care of you, someone who makes all this struggle unnecessary. All you have to do is stop fighting us and start fighting for yourself." For a moment, standing there surrounded by all that wealth and beauty and apparent happiness, I almost believed her. I almost let myself imagine what it would be like to stop struggling, to let someone else carry the weight of responsibility, to trade my uncertain independence for the security she was offering. But then I looked around at the faces surrounding us, at the eager curiosity and barely concealed contempt, at the way they watched my breakdown like it was entertainment, and I felt something harden inside me. "No," I said, and my voice was quiet but clear. I won't marry someone I don't love for money. I don't need to live a life that isn't mine." The disappointment that flashed across Victoria's face was quickly replaced by something colder, more calculating. "Then you're choosing to be alone," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the silent ballroom. "You're choosing to struggle and fail and end up with nothing. All because you're too proud to accept help. Maybe I am, I said, and for the first time all evening, I felt something like peace settle over me. Maybe I'd rather be alone than be with someone who only wants me as an accessory. Maybe I'd rather struggle for something I believe in than succeed at something that means nothing to me. I looked around at the assembled crowd, at their expensive clothes and their disapproving faces, at the world of privilege and entitlement that they represented. And maybe, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, the fact that you can't understand that choice says more about you than it does about me. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably. I had said the unspeakable, challenged the fundamental assumptions that governed their world. I had suggested that their way of life, their values, their choices might not be the only valid one. And in that moment, standing there in my discount dress with my head held high, I felt more powerful than I had ever felt in my life. The silence stretched taut as a violin string, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. I could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes boring into me, dissecting every detail of my appearance, cataloging every flaw in my armor. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to pulse with an almost malevolent energy, casting shadows that danced across the marble floor like specters of judgment. Victoria's face had transformed in the space of a heartbeat. Gone was the mask of concerned sisterly love, replaced by something raw and ugly that I had never seen before. Her perfectly glossed lips were pressed into a thin line, her blue eyes blazing with a fury that made my stomach clench with sudden fear. "You ungrateful little fool," she hissed, her voice low enough that only the inner circle of guests could hear, but carrying enough venom to poison the air between us. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you understand what you've just thrown away?" My mother stepped forward, her emerald gown rustling like the wings of some predatory bird. Her face was pale except for 2 spots of high color on her cheeks, a sure sign that her carefully controlled temper was beginning to fray. "Elena, you will apologize to your sister this instant," she commanded, her voice cutting through the hushed whispers of the crowd like a blade. But I found myself shaking my head, a strange sense of liberation flooding through my veins like champagne. "No," I said, and the word felt foreign on my tongue, rebellious and intoxicating. "I won't apologize for telling the truth." The gasp that rippled through the assembled guests was almost musical in its horror. These people, these titans of Chicago society, had never heard anyone refuse a direct command from Margaret Martinez. They stared at me, as if I had sprouted horns or begun speaking in tongues. My father moved to flank my other side, his movement calculated and predatory. In his tailored tuxedo, he looked every inch the successful businessman who had crushed competitors and claimed territories across the city, but there was something different in his expression now, something cold and calculating that I had only seen him turn on business rivals. "Elena," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "you are making a scene at your sister's engagement party. You are embarrassing our family in front of our closest friends and most important business associates. This behavior ends now." The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Our family's reputation, their standing in society, their business relationships, all of it was more important than my feelings, my choices, my right to speak my mind. I was expected to be a silent ornament, a supporting player in their carefully orchestrated lives. Or what? I asked. And even I was surprised by the defiance in my voice. "What exactly are you going to do to me, Dad? Cut me off from the money you never gave me? Disown me from the family that never really accepted me anyway?" The color drained from his face as if I had struck him. Around us, the crowd pressed closer, their conversations dying away entirely as they sensed that something unprecedented was about to unfold. The string quartet in the corner had given up all pretense of playing, and were watching the drama with the same rapt attention as everyone else. Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous. "Listen to yourself," she said, her voice rising enough to carry across the ballroom. "Listen to how pathetic you sound. You're so desperate to play the victim that you're willing to destroy your own family to do it." She turned to address the crowd, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to holding court. This is what I've been trying to tell you all about Alina. She's so committed to her narrative of being the poor, misunderstood artist that she can't see past her own self-pity. The murmurs of agreement from the crowd felt like physical blows. These people, these pillars of society, were nodding along with Victoria's assessment of my character. They saw me exactly as she wanted them to see me, as a bitter, delusional woman who couldn't accept reality. Alina has always had this fantasy, Victoria continued, warming to her theme, that her struggles make her special, that her poverty makes her pure, but you know what it really makes her. She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes gleaming with a malice I had never seen before, bitter, jealous, and completely delusional about her own worth. The words hit me like physical blows, each one precisely calculated to cause maximum damage. I felt my carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble, the strength I had found moments before wavering under the sustained assault. At least I know what my worth is, I said, my voice trembling slightly. At least I'm not selling myself to the highest bidder and calling it love. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the soft hiss of the air conditioning system, the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place with their trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre, as they watched the Martinez family tear itself apart. Victoria's face went through a series of transformations: shock, hurt, and finally a cold fury that made her blue eyes look like chips of Arctic ice. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that everyone in the ballroom had to strain to hear her. "You want to know about worth, Elaine," she said, each word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. "Let me tell you about worth." She began to pace in a small circle around me, like a predator circling wounded prey. The crowd shifted to accommodate her movement, creating a wider circle that felt more like a gladiatorial arena than a ballroom. "Worth is being loved," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Worth is being chosen by someone amazing, someone successful, someone who could have anyone but chose you. Worth is building a life that matters, that has impact, that leaves a legacy." She stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, could see the tiny flecks of gold in her angry eye. "Worth is not hiding in a cramped apartment, working for clients who don't respect you, pretending that being alone is the same thing as being independent." Each word was like a scalpel cutting away at the foundations of everything I had built, everything I believed about myself and my choice. I could feel my confidence bleeding away, my sense of self-worth evaporating under her systematic assault. "You want to talk about selling myself," Victoria continued, her voice rising to carry across the entire ballroom. "At least I'm worth buying. At least someone saw value in me, saw something worth investing in, worth building a future with." She gestured broadly at the assembled crowd, at the wealth and power that surrounded us on all sides. "Everyone in this room has chosen love over pride, partnership over isolation, success over struggle. Everyone except you." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd like a tide. They were with her, these people who had never known real hardship, never faced a choice between integrity and comfort. They saw her logic as irrefutable, her success as proof of her superior judgment. "You stand there in your discount dress," Victoria said, her voice dripping with contempt, "judging the rest of us for making smart choices, for building real lives, for choosing happiness over some misguided notion of artistic purity." My mother stepped closer, her face a mask of disappointed authority. "Victoria is right," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of frustration and unmet expectations. "You've wasted 10 years chasing after some impossible dream, and what do you have to show for it?" She gestured dismissively at my simple black dress, my modest jewelry, my obvious discomfort in this rarefied atmosphere. "You're 28 years old with nothing, no husband, no children, no real career, no future beyond whatever scraps you can piece together from month to month." The accuracy of her assessment hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't wrong about the facts. I was 28, I was single, I was struggling financially, I had no guarantee that my business would still exist in 5 years. But the way she presented those facts, the contempt in her voice,
made them sound like moral failings rather than life circumstances. But it's not too late, my father added, his voice taking on the tone he used when closing difficult business deals. You can still make the right choice. You can still accept our help. Let us introduce you to the right people and help you build a real life. The offer hung in the air between us like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. All I had to do was reach out and grab it, admit that they were right, that I had been wrong, that 10 years of independence had been nothing more than an extended tantrum. Michael Henderson is a good man, my mother continued, pressing her advantage. He comes from an excellent family, he has a solid career, and he's specifically looking for a wife who appreciates culture and the arts. You could pursue your creative interests as a hobby while building a real life with someone who can provide for you. There was that word again, reducing years of work and passion and growth to something frivolous, something to be indulged rather than respected. They would never understand that my work wasn't just how I made money, it was how I defined myself, how I proved to the world and to myself that I had value beyond my ability to be decorative. I don't want Michael Henderson, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ear. I don't want to be anyone's wife just for the sake of being married. Victoria's laugh was like the sound of crystal shattering. Then what do you want, Elena? What is this grand plan of yours? To spend the rest of your life alone, scraping together freelance projects, growing old in that pathetic little apartment. The future she painted was stark and terrifying in its accuracy. Was that what I want? To be 60 and still struggling to pay rent, still scrambling for clients, still pretending that my independence was worth the loneliness that came with it. At least I'll know I earned it, I said, but the words felt hollow now, rehearsed rather than heartfelt. Earned what? Victoria demanded, her voice rising to a near shout. Earned poverty, earned isolation, earned the right to die alone and forgotten. The crowd was pressing closer now, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that comes from witnessing someone else's destruction. They were feeding off the drama, drinking in every word of this very public family meltdown. You think your struggle makes you noble, Victoria continued, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. You think your poverty makes you pure, your loneliness makes you tragic and romantic, but you know what it really makes you. She paused, her eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to consume everything in its path. It makes you nothing. It makes you a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when pride becomes more important than happiness. The word nothing hung in the air like a curse, and I felt something inside me shatter. Not just my composure or my confidence, but something deeper, something fundamental to who I thought I was. She had found the secret fear that lived in the darkest corner of my heart and dragged it into the light for everyone to see. You are nothing, she repeated, her voice softer now, but somehow more devastating. Nothing without this family, nothing without the connections we could give you. Nothing without the life we could help you build if you weren't too stubborn and too proud to accept it. I stared at her, this woman who shared my blood but seemed like a complete stranger at that moment. The sister who had taught me to braid friendship bracelets, who had snuck into my room to comfort me during thunderstorms, who had once defended me against playground bullies. That person was gone, replaced by someone who could reduce me to nothing with surgical precision. I started to speak but no words came. What could I say in the face of such complete and systematic destruction? How could I defend a life that, when examined under the harsh light of their judgment, seemed pitifully small and meaningless? The crowd waited, their faces expectant, hungry for my response. They wanted to see me break completely, wanted to witness the moment when I finally admitted that they were right, that everything I had believed about myself and my choices had been nothing more than elaborate self-delusion. But instead of breaking, something strange happened. Instead of collapsing under the weight of their judgment, I felt a different kind of clarity settling over me like armor. They were right about the facts of my life. I was struggling, I was alone, I had no guarantee of future security, but they were wrong about what those facts meant. You're right, I said, my voice quiet but clear. I am nothing by your standards. I don't have a trust fund or a wealthy fiancé or a position in the family business. I don't have any of the things that matter to you. Victoria's eyes narrowed, sensing that this wasn't the capitulation she had been expecting. But that doesn't make me nothing, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. That makes me free to make my own choices, free to define my own worth, free to build a life that actually belongs to me. The murmur that went through the crowd was different this time, not agreement, but confusion, perhaps even a hint of unease. They had expected me to break, to crumble under their assault, to beg for forgiveness and acceptance. They hadn't expected me to find strength in the very things they saw as weaknesses. You want to know what I think? I said, looking around at the assembled faces, at the wealth and privilege and crushing conformity that surrounded me. I think you're the ones who are nothing. I think you're so desperate to fit into this narrow definition of success that you've forgotten what it feels like to actually be alive. The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. I had committed the ultimate sin. I had suggested that their way of life, their values, their very identities might be the real poverty. Victoria's face had gone white with rage, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. When she spoke, her voice was shaking with barely controlled fury. "How dare you," she whispered, and then louder, "how dare you stand there and judge us when you have nothing, when you are nothing, when your entire life is a pathetic attempt to convince yourself that failure is the same thing as virtue." She raised her hand, and for a moment, I thought she was going to gesture, to point, to make some dramatic flourish to emphasize her words, but instead, her palm came down across my cheek with a crack that echoed through the ballroom, like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop, as if the entire building was holding its breath. My cheek burned where her hand had connected, the sting sharp and immediate, and utterly shocking. I raised my own hand to my face, feeling the heat radiating from my skin, tasting blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my lip. Around us, the crowd was frozen in tableau, their faces showing varying degrees of shock, excitement, and horrified fascination. Victoria stood before me, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled from the force of her movement. Her eyes were wild, almost feral, as if the act of violence had unleashed something primitive and dangerous that she couldn't quite control. "That," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "is what happens when you forget your place." The words seemed to echo in the sudden quiet, bouncing off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers like an accusation. "Forget your place." The phrase was loaded with generations of expectation and control, with the understanding that some people were born to lead and others to follow, some to command and others to obey. But as I stood there with my cheek burning and my lip bleeding, I felt something crystallize inside me, something hard and unbreakable and utterly transformative. They had pushed me as far as they could push me, humiliated me as completely as it was possible to be humiliated, and I was still standing. I looked around at the crowd of faces surrounding us, at their hungry eyes and satisfied smiles, at the way they fed on drama and destruction, like vultures on carrion. These people who claimed to care about family and tradition and proper behavior had just watched a woman be struck in public and felt nothing but entertainment. And in that moment, I realized something that would change everything. I didn't want their approval. I didn't want their acceptance. I didn't want to be part of their world at all. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and met Victoria's wild eyes with a calm that surprised even me. "You're wrong," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I haven't forgotten my place. I've just realized it's not here." The confusion that flickered across Victoria's face was almost comical. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. I was supposed to break down, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness and acceptance. I wasn't supposed to find strength in her violence. "And you know what else?" I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The threat in my words was subtle but unmistakable, and I saw uncertainty flicker in Victoria's eyes for the first time all evening. She had expected her slap to be the final word, the ultimate assertion of dominance that would put me back in my place. Instead, it had been the catalyst for something she couldn't control or predict. I reached into my purse with deliberate calm, my fingers finding the familiar weight of my phone. The crowd watched my every movement with bated breath, sensing that the dynamic in the room had shifted in some fundamental way. "Because the thing is," I said, my thumb hovering over a contact I hadn't called in months, "you all assumed I was alone. You assumed I had nothing, no one, no resources beyond what you could see. Victoria's eyes narrowed, and I could see the first hint of real fear creeping into her expression. But you were wrong about that too. And with that, I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, my eyes never leaving Victoria's face, as I waited for the one person in the world who could turn this entire evening on its head to answer. The phone rang once, twice, and then I heard his voice, warm and familiar and powerful enough to shake the foundations of everything my family thought they knew about me. "Hello, Miss Blackstone," he said, and even though no one else could hear his words, I saw Victoria's face go pale as she read the recognition in my expression. "I was wondering when you'd finally call, Miss Blackstone," the voice repeated through my phone, and I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth despite the burning sting on my cheek. "I was wondering when you'd finally call." The name hit the assembled crowd like a physical I watched as recognition dawned on face after face, saw the color drain from my mother's complexion, witnessed my father's confident posture crumble like a house of cards. But it was Victoria's reaction that gave me the deepest satisfaction. Her eyes widened in pure shock, her mouth falling open in a way that was decidedly unflattering. Blackstone. In Chicago's elite circles, there was only one Blackstone family that mattered, and everyone in this ballroom knew exactly who they were. Tech empire, real estate holdings that dwarfed even the Martinez portfolio, pharmaceutical investments that had revolutionized medicine, and at the head of it all, Alexander Blackstone, 32 years old, ruthlessly intelligent, and worth more money than most small countries' GDP. "Hello, Alex," I said into the phone, my voice steady and warm, loud enough for the inner circle to hear every word. "I think it's time." The silence in the ballroom was so complete that I could hear his soft chuckle through the phone speaker. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back to hiding." I looked around at the faces surrounding me, at Victoria's shock, at my parents' dawning horror, at the crowd of socialites who had spent the evening treating me like an unwanted guest at their exclusive party. The sting on my cheek was already fading, but the memory of their cruelty would last forever. "I'm sure," I said. "I'm done hiding, then I'll be there in 10 minutes, Alex said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Try not to let them eat you alive before I arrive."
I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my purse, savoring the absolute silence that had fallen over the ballroom. The string quartet had long since given up any pretense of playing, their instruments hanging forgotten in their hands as they stared at me with the same shocked expression as everyone else. Victoria was the first to recover her voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Blackstone," she whispered, and I could see her mind racing, trying to process what she had just heard. "You know Alexander Blackstone." I tilted my head, studying her with the same detached interest she had shown me all evening. "Know him?" I repeated, and let a small smile play across my lips. "You could say that." My mother stepped forward, her emerald gown rustling like dead leaves. Her face had gone through several color changes in the past few minutes, from pale shock to flushed confusion, and now settling into a sickly green that matched her dress. "Alina, what exactly are you saying?" But before I could answer, my father moved closer, his business instincts finally overriding his shock. Robert Martinez hadn't built a real estate empire by being slow to recognize opportunity, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to understand what my connection to the Blackstone family might mean for his own interests. "Alina," he said, his voice taking on the careful tone he used with important clients, "if you have some kind of relationship with the Blackstone family, perhaps we should discuss this privately." Relationship, such a careful, neutral word. He couldn't bring himself to ask the question directly, couldn't voice the possibility that his failures of a daughter might somehow be connected to the most powerful family in Chicago. The same daughter he had just finished helping to publicly humiliate. "Oh, we can discuss it right here," I said, gesturing broadly at the assembled crowd. "After all, everyone's been so interested in my personal life tonight. It seems only fair to share." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was electric with anticipation. These people lived for gossip, for scandal, for any piece of information that might give them social currency at the next gathering. The idea that quiet, struggling Elena Martinez might have some secret connection to Alexander Blackstone was more thrilling than anything they had experienced in months. Victoria had recovered enough of her composure to arrange her features into something resembling her earlier confidence, though I could see the uncertainty lurking behind her eyes. "Elena, if this is some kind of joke. Do I look like I'm joking?" I asked, and touched my fingers lightly to my still stinging cheek. "You just slapped me in front of 300 people because I refused to accept your version of my worth. Do you really think I would make up a connection to the Blackstone family at a time like this?" The logic of my statement was undeniable, and I watched as the reality of the situation began to sink in around the room. Conversations had stopped entirely now, every ear straining to catch our words, every eye fixed on our small group at the center of the ballroom. "But how?" my mother began, then stopped, clearly struggling to formulate a question that wouldn't reveal the depth of their ignorance about my life. "How do I know Alexander Blackstone?" I finished for her. "How long have I known him? What exactly is the nature of our relationship?" I paused, enjoying the way they hung on my every word. "Those are all very good questions, Mother. Questions you might have known the answers to if you'd shown any interest in my life over the past 3 years." The accusation hit its mark, and I saw my mother flinch, as if I had struck her. Around us, the crowd pressed closer, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that comes from witnessing a complete social upheaval. "3 years," my father repeated, his voice carefully controlled. "You've known Alexander Blackstone for 3 years. Among other things," I said, and left the statement deliberately vague. Let them wonder, let them guess, let them experience the same uncertainty and confusion they had put me through all evening. Victoria's face was cycling through expressions like a broken kaleidoscope. Shock, confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Elena, stop playing games. If you really know Alexander Blackstone, then just say so. Don't drag this out for dramatic effect." Dramatic effect. Even now, even faced with the possibility that everything she thought she knew about me was wrong, she couldn't resist trying to diminish me, to suggest that my behavior was somehow calculated for attention rather than genuine. "You want me to stop playing games?" I asked, and I could hear the steel creeping into my voice. "Fine, let me be perfectly clear. Alexander Blackstone isn't just someone I know. He isn't just a friend or a business contact, or some distant acquaintance I met at a charity function." I paused, looking around at the sea of expectant faces, at my family's growing horror, at the crowd of socialites who had spent the evening treating me like a curiosity at best and an embarrassment at worst. "Alexander Blackstone is my husband." The words dropped into the silence like a bomb, and the explosion of sound that followed was immediate and deafening. Gasps, exclamations, the crash of someone dropping a champagne glass, the scrape of chairs as people leaned forward or stepped back in shock. The carefully controlled atmosphere of the elegant engagement party dissolved into chaos in the space of a heartbeat. "Husband?" Victoria's voice cracked on the word, rising to a pitch that was almost a shriek. "That's impossible. You're not married. You don't even have a boyfriend." "Don't?" I asked, and pulled my left hand from where I had kept it carefully hidden in the folds of my dress all evening. The ring that caught the light was simple compared to Victoria's massive engagement diamond, but anyone with knowledge of jewelry would recognize the flawless 10-carat emerald surrounded by diamonds as worth more than most people's houses. The gasps from the crowd were audible, but it was my mother's strangled cry that cut through the noise. "Elena, what have you done? What have you done? Not congratulations, not joy for my happiness, not amazement at my good fortune." Her first thought was that I had somehow made a mistake, somehow ruined something that should have belonged to someone else. "I fell in love," I said simply, "and more importantly, someone fell in love with me. Someone who sees value in exactly the person I am, not the person you think I should become." My father was staring at the ring on my finger with the expression of a man watching his entire worldview crumble. "When?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "When did this happen?" "We met 3 years ago," I said, enjoying the way the timeline seemed to physically pain him. At a coffee shop in the Loop. He was there for a business meeting that got cancelled. I was there working on a design project for a small nonprofit. We started talking about art, books, and life. He asked me to dinner. I said yes. The simplicity of it seemed to shock them more than the grandeur of it would have. They were expecting some fairy tale story of rescue and transformation, not the ordinary human connection that had actually brought Alex and me together. But your name, my mother said, grasping for some explanation that would make sense of this impossible revelation. Your name is still Martinez. You're not married. My professional name is still Martinez. I correct. Elena Martinez is the name on my business cards, on my website, on my tax returns, but legally, for the past 18 months, I've been Elena Blackstone. 18 months. I watched as they did the math, as they realized that I had been married for a year and a half without telling them, without inviting them, without even mentioning that I was in a relationship. The betrayal they felt was written clearly across their faces, though they seemed incapable of understanding why I might have chosen to exclude them from the most important day of my life. You eloped, Victoria said, and her voice was flat with shock. You married Alexander Blackstone in secret. I married the man I love in private, I corrected. Alex suggested we could have a big wedding, invite everyone, make it a social event, but I told him I wanted something that belonged to just us, something that couldn't be turned into a performance or a networking opportunity. The dig was subtle but clear, and I saw Victoria's face flush with anger and embarrassment. Her engagement party was exactly the kind of elaborate social performance I had chosen to avoid, and everyone in the room was now comparing the two events in their mind. Besides, I continued, given how you've all treated me tonight, given how you've talked about my worth and my choices and my future, can you honestly say you would have been supportive of my marriage? Can you say you would have celebrated my happiness instead of trying to figure out how to use it for your own advantage? The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and I watched as my family struggled to find an answer that wouldn't damn them further. They couldn't deny it, couldn't claim they would have been supportive, because their behavior tonight had proven exactly the opposite. The sound of car doors slamming outside cut through the tense silence, followed by the measured footsteps of someone walking up the front steps of the country club. My heart began to race with anticipation and relief. Alex was here. My backup was arriving, and the game was about to change completely. The massive oak doors of the ballroom swung open, and a ripple of recognition swept through the crowd like a wave. Alexander Blackstone stepped into the room with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it, the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with dark hair that always looked slightly tousled despite the obvious expense of his haircut. His suit was perfectly tailored but understated, the kind of elegant simplicity that only came from having enough money to not need to prove anything to anyone. But it was his eyes that drew attention, dark gray, intelligent, and currently scanning the room with the focused intensity of a predator assessing his territory. His gaze found mine across the crowded ballroom, and the smile that crossed his face was warm enough to melt ice. Without hesitation, he began moving through the crowd which parted before him like the Red Sea. These people who had been so dismissive of me just minutes before now stepped aside with murmured greetings and respectful nods, their entire demeanor changing in the presence of real power. "Sorry I'm late, darling," he said as he reached me, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. Traffic was murder, and I couldn't find anywhere to park the Bentley. He leaned down and kissed me softly, his hand coming up to cup my face with a gentleness that was in stark contrast to the violence I had experienced just minutes before. When he pulled back, his eyes were concerned as they took in my still flushed cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low but audible to those standing closest to us. "You sounded upset on the phone." "I'm fine now," I said, and meant it. With Alex beside me, I felt like I could take on the world, just having a family discussion about my work. His eyes darkened as he took in the defensive postures of my family, the shocked faces of the crowd, the tension that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Alexander Blackstone hadn't built a business empire by being slow to read a room, and I could see him processing the situation with the swift efficiency that had made him legendary in Chicago's business circle. "I see," he said, his voice taking on a note of steel that sent a visible shiver through the nearby guests. "And what conclusion did we reach about your worth?" The question was addressed to me, but his eyes were fixed on Victoria, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. The woman who had been so confident just minutes before now looked like she wanted to disappear into the marble floor. "Well," I said, enjoying the way my family hung on every word. The consensus seemed to be that I was nothing without them. Nothing without their connections, their money, their guidance, just a pathetic woman clinging to impossible dreams. Alex's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "How interesting," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're everything. Everything I've ever wanted, everything I've ever needed, everything that makes my life worth living." The romantic declaration would have been enough to silence the room on its own, but coming from Alexander Blackstone, delivered in front of Chicago's elite, it carried the weight of a corporate merger announcement. These people understood the language of power and money, and they were fluent enough to recognize when the balance had shifted completely. "Darling," Alex continued, turning to address the crowd with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "I don't believe I've been properly introduced to your family." The understatement was so deliberate, so perfectly calculated, that I had to fight to keep from laughing. He knew exactly who my family was, and had known for 3 years, but he was making them sweat, making them understand that their previous dismissal of me had consequences they were only beginning to comprehend. "Of course," I said, playing along with obvious enjoyment. "Alex, this is my sister Victoria, who's celebrating her engagement tonight. Victoria, this is my husband, Alexander Blackstone." The introduction was formal, polite, and absolutely devastating in its implication. Victoria, who had spent the evening positioning herself as the successful sister, the one who had made all the right choices, was now face to face with proof that I had surpassed her in ways she couldn't have imagined. "Congratulations on your engagement," Alex said, extending his hand to Victoria with perfect politeness. "I'm sure you'll be very happy." Victoria stared at his outstretched hand like it might bite her, clearly struggling to process the reversal of fortune that had just occurred. The hand that had struck me just minutes before now trembled as she reached out to shake him. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "And you must be Elena's parents," Alex continued, turning to my mother and father with the same polite attention. "I've heard so much about you." The statement was perfectly neutral, but given the context of the evening, it carried ominous implications. What exactly had I told him about them? How much did he know about their treatment of me? And more importantly, what did he plan to do with that information? "Mr. Blackstone," my father said, stepping forward with his hand extended, and his businessman's instincts finally overriding his shock. "This is unexpected. We had no idea Elena was even in a relationship." "Didn't you?" Alex asked, and his tone was mildly curious, as if he genuinely couldn't understand how they had missed something so significant. "How strange. I would have thought that the happiness of someone you love would be impossible to overlook." The subtle rebuke hit its mark, and I saw my father's face redden with embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. Around us, the crowd was hanging on every word, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that comes from witnessing a complete social earthquake. "Perhaps," Alex continued, his arm sliding around my waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive, "we should start over. After all, we're family now." Family. The word hung in the air like a challenge, a reminder that the dynamics in the room had changed irrevocably. I was no longer the struggling daughter who could be dismissed and controlled. I was Alexander Blackstone's wife, which made me one of the most powerful women in Chicago whether I wanted to be or not. And as I stood there in my simple black dress with my billionaire husband's arm around me, watching my family struggle to comprehend the magnitude of their miscalculation, I realized that the real game was just beginning. The silence in the ballroom stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point, ready to snap at any moment. Alexander's presence had transformed the entire atmosphere, turning what had been a comfortable gathering of Chicago's elite into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. I could feel the shift in the air, the way power had suddenly redistributed itself around the room like pieces on a chessboard after an unexpected queen's gambit. My mother was the first to attempt recovery, her social instincts finally overriding her shock. Margaret Martinez hadn't clawed her way to the top of Chicago society by being slow to adapt to changing circumstances, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to calculate how to salvage something from this disaster. "Blackstone," she said, her voice taking on the honey-sweet tone she reserved for the most important clients. "We're so delighted to finally meet you. Elena has been so private about her personal life. We had no idea she had found such happiness." The lie came so smoothly, so effortlessly, that I almost admired her skill. In the space of 30 seconds, she had transformed from a woman who had been publicly humiliating her daughter into a loving mother who had simply been kept in the dark about my joy. It was masterful in its audacity. Alex's smile was polite but cold, the kind of expression he wore in boardrooms when someone was trying to sell him something he had no intention of buying. "Private," he repeated, testing the word like it might reveal hidden meanings. "Is that what we're calling?" He turned to look at me, his gray eyes warm with affection and something that might have been amusement. "Darling, you didn't tell me your family was so understanding about your need for privacy. From what you've shared with me, I had gotten quite a different impression." The statement hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, and I watched my family's faces cycle through various expressions of panic as they tried to figure out exactly what I might have told him about them. The truth was that I had told Alex everything, every dismissive comment, every attempt to control my choices, every time they had made me feel small and worthless. He knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of. "Perhaps," my father interjected, his businessman's instincts finally kicking in despite his obvious discomfort, "we could discuss this in a more private setting. I'm sure we all have much to catch up on." But Alex shook his head, his arm tightening slightly around my waist. "I think this setting is perfect," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. After all, it was in this very public forum that Elena's worth was being evaluated. It seems only appropriate that any corrections to that evaluation should be equally public. The word corrections sent a visible shiver through the crowd. These people understood the language of power, and they could sense that Alexander Blackstone was about to make a statement that would reshape the social landscape of Chicago society. Victoria, who had been unnaturally quiet since Alex's arrival, finally found her voice. "Elena," she said, and I could hear the desperation creeping in despite her attempts to maintain composure. "Surely you understand that we were only trying to help you. We were concerned about your future, about your happiness. Were you?" I asked, tilting my head as if genuinely considering her words. "Because from where I was standing, it sounded more like you were concerned about my refusal to conform to your expectation." I looked around at the assembled crowd, at the faces that had been so eager to witness my humiliation just minutes before, and were now hanging on every word with a different kind of hunger. "You see, everyone here tonight got to witness what my family really thinks of me, how they define my worth, how they measure my value as a human being." My voice grew stronger as I continued, fed by the months of suppressed anger and hurt that I had carried like a weight in my chest. "They measured me by my bank account, by my marital status, by my willingness to be decorative and compliant. And when I failed to meet their standards, when I insisted on defining my own worth, they decided I was nothing." The crowd shifted uncomfortably as my words hit their mark. Many of these people had participated in or at least enjoyed my public humiliation, and now they were being forced to confront their own complicity in what was starting to look like a grave miscalculation. I continued, my voice taking on a note of steel that I had never heard before. "While they were so busy dismissing my choices, so focused on what I lacked according to their narrow definition of success, they completely missed what I had actually built." Alex's smile was proud and fierce as he watched me claim my power, watched me transform from the wounded woman who had called him in desperation into someone who could command a room full of Chicago's most powerful people. "I built a successful business," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "Not a hobby, not a little project to keep me busy, but a real company with real clients and real revenue. I built a life that belonged entirely to me,
free from the expectations and manipulations of people who claimed to love me but couldn't accept who I actually was. I paused, looking directly at Victoria, whose face had gone pale beneath her perfect makeup. And yes, I built a partnership with someone who saw value in exactly the person I am, not the person he thought I should become. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was different now, not the cruel amusement they had shown earlier, but something closer to respect, or at least a grudging recognition that they had seriously misjudged the situation. "Elena," my mother said, her voice thin with barely controlled panic, "we never meant to suggest that you weren't successful. We were simply concerned that you were working so hard, struggling so much, when you didn't have to." "Struggling," Alex repeated, and his voice carried a note of dangerous amusement. "That's an interesting way to describe building a graphic design firm that's been profitable for 3 consecutive years, and is currently being courted by 2 major advertising agencies for acquisition." The information hit the crowd like a physical blow. A profitable business, acquisition offers. This wasn't the picture of failure and desperation that had been painted earlier in the evening. "You see," Alex continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had made him legendary in Chicago's business circles, "what Elena's family failed to understand is that success comes in many forms. They were so focused on traditional markers, marriage, financial dependence, social conformity, that they completely missed the fact that she had achieved something much more impressive." He turned to address the crowd directly, his presence commanding attention without effort. "Elena built something from nothing, no trust fund, no family connections, no safety net beyond her own talent and determination. In the business world, we call that entrepreneurship. We celebrate it, invest in it, recognize it, as one of the highest forms of achievement." The contrast he was drawing was subtle but devastating. While Victoria had achieved security through marriage, and my parents had built their wealth through real estate, I had created value through pure innovation and skill. In the hierarchy of business achievement, what I had accomplished actually ranked higher than what any of them had done. "But, perhaps," Alex continued, his voice taking on a note of mock consideration, "we should discuss Elena's other achievement. After all, it's not every day that someone manages to catch the attention of a Blackstone." The crowd leaned in closer, hungry for details about how this impossible romance had unfolded. These people lived for insider information, for the kind of exclusive details that would make them the center of attention at future gatherings. "We met at a coffee shop," Alex said, his voice warm with the memory. "Elena was working on a design project for a children's literacy nonprofit, refusing payment because she believed in their mission. I was there for a business meeting that had been canceled, feeling frustrated and disconnected from anything that mattered." He looked down at me with an expression so full of love that I felt my breath catch in my throat. She was arguing with her laptop, muttering about font choices and color palettes, completely absorbed in creating something beautiful for people who couldn't afford to pay her market rate. I was mesmerized. The romantic picture he painted was so different from the narrative of desperation and failure that had dominated the evening, that the crowd seemed to struggle to reconcile the 2 versions of reality. "I asked her to dinner," Alex continued. "She said no, said she was too busy, had too many deadlines, couldn't spare the time for dinner with a stranger who might just be wasting her time." A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd at this revelation. The idea that someone had initially rejected Alexander Blackstone was both shocking and oddly charming. "It took me 3 weeks to convince her to go out with me," he said, and his voice carried a note of rueful amusement. 3 weeks of showing up at that coffee shop, bringing her better coffee than they served, listening to her talk about design theory and social justice and the responsibility of art to make the world better. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes as he recounted those early days, the slow courtship that had felt so natural and right, so different from the transactional relationships that dominated my family's world. "By the time she finally agreed to dinner," Alex continued, "I was completely gone, not because she was available or convenient or socially appropriate, but because she was brilliant and passionate and utterly herself, regardless of what anyone else thought she should be." The silence in the ballroom was profound now, broken only by the soft rustle of fabric as people shifted to get a better view of this unfolding love story that was rewriting everything they thought they knew about power and value and worth. "We were married 18 months ago," Alex said, his voice taking on a note of quiet pride. "Small ceremony, just us and two witnesses, because Elena wanted something that belonged to us alone, something that couldn't be turned into a performance or a networking opportunity." The dig at Victoria's elaborate engagement party was subtle but unmistakable, and I saw my sister flinch as if she had been slapped. "But tonight," Alex continued, his voice hardening as he returned to the matter at hand, "tonight I received a phone call from my wife, a woman I love more than my own life, crying because her family had just finished explaining to her, in front of 300 witnesses, that she was worthless without them." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and I watched my family struggle to find words that could possibly justify what they had done. They had gone too far, pushed too hard, and now they were facing consequences they couldn't have imagined. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence, "it was worse than that. They didn't just tell me I was worthless, they had a solution to offer."
I turned to look directly at my parents, at the panic that was beginning to show through their carefully maintained composure. They wanted to introduce me to Michael Henderson, set up a nice dinner party where I could meet a suitable husband who might be willing to take on the charity case that was my life. The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible. The Henderson family was well known in Chicago society, but they were several tiers below the Blackstones in both wealth and influence. The idea that my parents had been trying to set me up with Michael Henderson while I was already married to Alexander Blackstone was so absurd that it bordered on comedy. "Michael's a nice enough fellow," Alex said, his voice carefully neutral. "His family's furniture business is quite successful. He'd make someone a perfectly adequate husband, I'm sure." The faint praise was more devastating than any insult could have been. Alexander Blackstone discussing Michael Henderson the way someone might discuss a reliable accountant or a competent middle manager. "But I think," Alex continued, his voice taking on an edge that made several people in the crowd step back involuntarily, "that Elena deserves better than adequate. Don't you?" The question was addressed to my family, but it carried the weight of a corporate boardroom ultimatum. This wasn't really a question at all. It was a statement of fact that they were expected to acknowledge and accept. My father cleared his throat, his businessman instincts finally overriding his shock as he recognized that he was in serious danger of permanently alienating one of the most powerful men in Chicago. "Of course," he said quickly, "Elena deserves the very best. We've always wanted her to be happy, have you?" Alex asked, and his tone was mildly curious, as if he genuinely wanted to understand their logic. "Because from what Elena has told me, and from what I witnessed tonight, it seems like you've spent considerable energy trying to convince her that her choices were wrong, her life was meaningless, and her worth was conditional on your approval." Each word was like a scalpel cutting away the pretenses and justifications they had built around their behavior. They stood exposed in front of Chicago's elite, revealed as the kind of people who would publicly humiliate their own daughter because she refused to conform to their expectations. "We were concerned," my mother said weakly, her social armor finally beginning to crack. "We wanted her to have security, stability." "She has security," Alex interrupted, his voice sharp. "She has the security of knowing that someone loves her exactly as she is. She has the stability of a marriage built on mutual respect and admiration. And she has the financial stability that comes from being married to someone who would give her anything she wanted while respecting her desire to earn her own way." He paused, letting the implications of his words sink in. "What she doesn't have, what she's never had, is a family that celebrates her achievements instead of trying to tear them down." The accusation was devastating in its accuracy, and I watched my family's carefully constructed social personas crumble under the weight of their own exposed cruelty. "But that's going to change," Alex continued, his voice taking on the implacable tone he used when announcing corporate decisions that would reshape entire industries. "Because Elena is my wife, which makes her one of the most important people in my world, and I protect the people who matter to me." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "Cross Elena again, and you would be crossing Alexander Blackstone with all the consequences that entail." "I think," he said, his arm tightening around my waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. That it's time for us to go home. Elena has had quite enough family bonding for one evening. But before we could move, Victoria stepped forward, her face desperate and her voice cracking with emotion. Elena, please, you can't just leave like this. We're family. We love you. I looked at her, this woman who had shared my childhood but had become a stranger, and felt something inside me settle into place. Love doesn't humiliate, I said quietly. Love doesn't tear down. Love doesn't demand that someone become smaller so that you can feel bigger. I looked around at the assembled crowd, at the faces that had been so eager to witness my destruction and were now watching my triumph with a mixture of awe and envy. I spent years trying to earn your approval, I continued, my voice growing strong. Years thinking that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, proved myself enough, you would finally see me as worthy of respect. I turned back to Victoria, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. But tonight, you showed me that your approval was never worth earning. Because people who would do what you did tonight, people who would take pleasure in someone else's pain, people who measure worth by bank accounts and social status, those people's opinions don't matter. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft sound of someone in the crowd beginning to cry, whether from emotion or embarrassment. I couldn't tell and didn't care. Alex, I said, turning to my husband with a smile that felt like sunshine after a storm. I'd like to go home now. Of course, darling, he said, his voice warm with love and pride. But first I think there's something these people should know. He turned to address the crowd one final time, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making announcements that would be reported in the morning paper. The Blackstone Foundation will be making a significant donation to several Chicago charities this year, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. Organizations focused on supporting women entrepreneurs, providing business education to underserved communities, and helping people build financial independence. The implication was clear. He was supporting the kind of work I had been doing, the path I had chosen, the values they had dismissed as worthless. Elena will be overseeing the selection process, he continued. After all, no one understands the importance of genuine achievement better than someone who has built something from nothing. And with that, we turned and walked toward the exit, the crowd parting before us like water. Behind us I could hear the explosion of conversation as 300 of Chicago's most influential people began processing what they had just witnessed, and calculating how this shift in power would affect their own social standing. As we reached the door, I turned back one last time to look at my family. They stood in the center of the ballroom like survivors of a natural disaster, surrounded by the wreckage of their assumptions and the debris of their cruelty. Goodbye, I said simply, and the word felt like a door closing on one life and opening onto another. Outside in the cool night air, Alex pulled me close, his hand gently touching my cheek where Victoria's slap had left its mark. Are you all right? He asked, his voice soft with concern. I looked back at the country club, at the golden light spilling from its windows, at the world I had finally walked away from. Then I looked up at my husband, at the man who had seen my worth when I had almost forgotten it myself, and smiled. I'm perfect, I said, and for the first time in my life I meant it completely. As we walked toward the Bentley, I could hear the sounds of the party resuming behind us, but it felt like an echo from another world. Tomorrow, the story of tonight will spread through Chicago society like wildfire. The Martinez family's public humiliation of their daughter and the revelation of Elena Martinez Blackstone would become the kind of legend that people would still be talking about years from now, but that was their world, not mine. I had found something better than their approval, something more valuable than their acceptance. I had found myself and someone who loved exactly who I was. And as we drove away into the night, leaving the glittering ballroom and its small-minded occupants behind us, I knew that I would never again allow anyone to make me feel like I was nothing, because I wasn't. I was everything that mattered, everything that was real, everything that was worth loving. I was Elena Blackstone, and I was finally, completely, gloriously free. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.